Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future.
Welcome to a new episode of Shaken Not Burned. I'm your host, Giulia Bottaro. The world needs to plug a biodiversity finance gap worth $700 billion per year to effectively protect and restore nature, according to the United Nations. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, to which most countries agreed in 2022, calls for a significant scaling up of investment from both public and private sources to get there. An emerging tool is the biodiversity market to raise financing for conservation projects. It's a similar concept to the carbon markets. However, it's a little bit more complicated. Carbon credits can be traded because a gram of CO2 entering the atmosphere is the same globally, while biodiversity impacts are very local. And the carbon markets have been fraught with significant controversies and challenges, raising concerns about encountering the same issues. In today's episode, we will explore this new space with Simas Gradeckas, founder at Bloom Labs. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Julia. It's nice to be here.
Can you tell me a little bit about your experience and how you got into this very specific niche?
Well, it wasn't by design. I'll tell you that much. It started off as an exploration to build something on my own. My background is in business, international business, and then I went down the startup route in Germany and then the Silicon Valley. Quickly got bored, so quit and started exploring, and nothing would scratch the itch until I found the climate finance field. Then I, half a year in, realized that what really speaks to me is, or what I feel most connected to, is nature and biodiversity, and I felt that like it's a more holistic metric of planetary health than just a single and that led me down this rabbit hole. I was also swept into it in a way because back in the day, in December 2022, we had this landmark international agreement called Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the biodiversity equivalent of the Paris Agreement in 2015 for climate. Everyone was buzzing around biodiversity finance, and I jumped into that field at first. Really wanted to build a startup in that space, realized that it's way too early for biodiversity credits. But, I've done so much research on my own that, my head was, or information in my head was spilling. So I just started a newsletter to share some of that research, and it found a very receptive audience. And, that was the first step to where I am now.
For our listeners, I actually discovered you through your newsletter, which is incredibly informative, but also simple to understand, because these things are very difficult, and maybe that's why it's so successful, because it's a new space and people are confused, and we need that sort of educational resource. Do you feel that the enthusiasm that you talked about in 2022 has perhaps quietened already, or, how is this hype going?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think it's natural for hype cycles to go in phases, and definitely I, like most folks, got swept up at the high, and the natural low is the next step. And I would say, let's say 2022 and especially 2023 was the phase of the high, and then during 2024 reality slowly settled in, and now this year in 2025 we're really seeing how difficult it is to scale, let's say, university finance privately, especially on the voluntary side. And that's when actually real work is being done as well at the same time. So the area of challenges is also the area of opportunity. So definitely a lot of it has quieted down, but the folks who really care about this space, they continue working.
Yeah, I see. Actually, that's one of the questions, is about, what this all means for companies. Everything was about carbon, more or less, for a very long time. And then a few years ago, there was this sort of quote-unquote discovery that we need to talk about nature, we need to address the impacts on air, water, etc. But I feel sometimes it may still be a bit of an abstract concept for companies. And also when you talk about biodiversity finance, a lot of people say, well, we live in a capitalistic world, so to save and protect nature, we need to put a price on it. And other people say, well, let's stop commodifying everything. Can we leave nature alone at least? So, in all of this, what does this all mean for companies? What should businesses do? Very simple question.
Very simple question. I have at least 10 different ways I could answer this, but I would take a step back and say that actually nature is much closer to companies than, for example, climate. Climate is a more global or planetary concept that you don't feel as much locally, but with nature, if there were woods next to you that maybe helped prevent flood risk or cool down the area, and then it gets cut down, the effects are very local and visible. So it's more graspable, more material, and it's also as we progress with quantifying nature, as bad as that sounds for many people, but under current socioeconomic system, that's the way it is. As we untangle more of these links between nature and economy, we can see how material and how important commercially nature is if we're speaking from the perspective of the companies. So you have this circulating number that 55% of the global GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature, and everybody keeps repeating that. But what people miss out is that actually the full dependency on nature by our economies is 100%. It's just you just need to peel enough layers to get to the point that okay, well, clean water, food, etc. All of these fuels, all of these come from nature. So we're getting to the point where our economies have gotten so large that ignoring these natural limitations becomes impossible. Nature is that final frontier that we cannot ignore.
Interesting. So let's talk now about the biodiversity markets. We have so many questions. So we'll start maybe with what is their purpose? Why are they useful? Who are they serving?
Well, purpose is to fund nature at scale. And I would add with additionality, this specific concept in environmental markets, which is we need fresh sources of funding for nature without removing or decreasing existing funding as well. So we need net new funding for nature. And let's say at the highest level, under the current circumstances, increasing that nature through public funding only is just politically unfeasible. Hence, there's been a big push to also add the private funding as part of that funding mix, which has historically been a very small part of the total pie that goes to nature. And what does private finance need? It needs markets, and biodiversity credits is the mechanism that aims to resolve this challenge.
Can you explain more specifically what biodiversity credit is?
Sure. You have a single official definition that people like using, and it's the most accepted one. So I'll quote it, but then I'll explain it as well. So officially, a biodiversity credit is a certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit, positive biodiversity outcome that is durable and additional to what otherwise would have occurred. In general terms, it is basically a standardized unit of biodiversity gain or avoided loss. And the key word is standardized. It's something that on an accounting perspective is interchangeable and something that could be integrated into corporate financial accounting as well, or governmental financial accounting, just financial accounting in general. And what's important is that it is permanent, so it lasts ideally for hundreds of years and additional to what otherwise would have occurred. And we're touching upon some of the fundamental problems with the environmental markets, especially on the voluntary side. But these units represent standardized biodiversity gain or avoided loss.
And this is where the challenge is, right? Because in one place in Europe, it could be, maybe I'm saying it wrong, but like this water is cleaner. And somewhere else in South America we didn't cut these flowers. Is that correct? It's so different wherever you are in the world.
Yeah. So you're getting at the core, let's say, difference of the voluntary biodiversity market, and even compliance markets, but let's stay with the voluntary for now. Which is there's no standardized unit of account as it is in the voluntary carbon market, which is a ton of CO2 or its equivalents. And yeah, everyone, first of all, we just don't have a shared agreement on how to measure nature, because you don't need to necessarily quantify the same indicators and metrics to say that, biodiversity, to claim that biodiversity credits could be interchangeable or used into financial accounting. What you do need is a single system that kind of connects all of these different ways to measure biodiversity into a single interchangeable system in that sense. And I'm happy to speak more about that. It's called ecosystem condition, and it's slowly becoming the norm in the space where you are able to take in local biodiversity context and then convert it into also units that could be translated and used globally as well.
So this standardized system exists?
It's getting there. It's definitely not yet in place, but maybe let me just take a step back and share the current situation around ecosystem condition. So
it
it's
would
a
also
concept,
be interesting, to know who is behind this system as well.
Yes, exactly. So it's a concept pioneered by the UN System on Environmental Ecological Accounting, UNSEEA. So it's the most authoritative source you could imagine, because all of the new nature accounting frameworks like corporate sustainability reporting directive in the EU, the task force for nature financial disclosures, global reporting initiative, etc. All of these nature accounting frameworks quantify biodiversity using ecosystem condition as the core concept, and it has a well-established, let's call it, typology of ways to quantify ecosystem condition through species and ecosystem level metrics. And you can go down the rabbit hole of all the different subcategories there. But what matters is that biodiversity credits and the schemes that create rules for issuing these credits have also adopted ecosystem condition, or more and more of these schemes are adopting this framework, basically requiring the credit projects to measure biodiversity in a way that could be defined through ecosystem condition. So you could say one biodiversity credit is a 1 point increase in the ecosystem condition of that ecosystem, or for 1 hectare for 1 year, for example. But ecosystem condition becomes the core, let's call it, meta measurement framework. And now it allows the credits to also be used for nature accounting as well, for frameworks like TNFD, CSRD, etc. So we're getting to standardization. I'm realizing how convoluted it all sounds, but it's not there yet. So at the moment we have over 50 different biodiversity credit schemes. Actually, privately, we've benchmarked over 80, and most of them have different units of biodiversity credits. Each single one of them means different things.
So you mentioned there corporate targets under the TNFD, for example, TFND. So can you explain a bit what this means and how this comes together then with the biodiversity markets?
Yeah, so TNFD is a great example of the increased importance of nature in the corporate boardrooms as well. And TNFD is a voluntary nature accounting framework that basically defines the structure on how to measure and report on nature as a corporate. It's built around 4 core concepts. First, the companies must map out their dependencies on nature and impacts to nature, which follows this a concept of double materiality, where you have to not only share your financial risks of how you are impacted by nature, but also how you impact nature as well negatively, which is a novel concept to begin with. And then once you have kind of mapped out your interface with nature as a company, you also need to quantify financial risks that nature or nature degradation poses, and then also the opportunities that opens up. Usually the opportunities come in the format of risk reduction, because nature-related risks can be very, very costly in certain industries. And under this framework, now you have the initial rules being built on how companies will need to report in nature, most likely regulatory context as well. So TNFD right now is voluntary, but we're seeing more and more jurisdictions consider adding all or parts of TNFD into their regulatory corporate sustainability frameworks as well. So a very similar thing is happening to what happened with TCFD. So it's the initial climate or carbon accounting framework called Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures. Nature is following that process almost step by step. And now TCFD used to be a voluntary framework. Now it doesn't exist anymore, but it's been integrated into different regulatory frameworks. So the work has been disseminated, and now carbon accounting is becoming the norm. You have to quantify your climate impacts. The same thing happening for nature at the moment as well.
So this thing of identifying a biodiversity unit helps, across the board. It helps you with your corporate nature targets, and it also helps anyone in the biodiversity markets.
Yeah, well, you can think about it this way as a corporate. Imagine you need to map out how you depend on nature and then how you negatively impact nature. So you will have to report on it. Now, obviously, the natural thing to do is to avoid any negative impacts, minimize them, go through the so-called mitigation hierarchy. But we are not at the point now, economically nor technologically, to where companies could have no negative impacts on nature. They're residual, and a lot of them, the moment or ever, are not avoidable. So you need to do something about it, or you are implicitly pressed then to also do more certified positive work on nature, which comes in the form of you preserving or restoring ecosystems. Then not necessarily directly offset your impacts, because it's much harder for nature than it is for carbon. But at least you're under more pressure to show that you're not only causing negative impacts once you are now forced to report on your negative impacts. And up until this point, no companies, no mining company or oil and gas company or any other big emitter and big biodiversity loss driver, none of them are incentivized to share anything negative, any negative impacts on nature. But now they will have to. And once they have to, there's more implicit and social pressure to do something about it. And that's where biodiversity credits come in, where it can act as a high integrity, certifiable way to deliver nature outcomes and report on them as well.
This thing about offset is what you mentioned earlier, and that's the thing that is driving a lot of concern in the carbon markets is, well, I can do whatever I want. I can drive all the destruction that I want because I will buy an offset and it's fine. So how can we avoid this essentially greenwash?
Well, first of all, I should say that at the moment, even credits aside, globally, but even in the Western world, where let's say jurisdictions are a bit more sophisticated, most nature impacts are not offset, while they are also not prevented. So if you want to clear cut land, let's say in the US or in most of the European countries, that is not a protected area, you can do that with no expectation to let's say do anything positive for nature. And that's the status quo. So that aside, offsetting gets such a bad rep for a lot of the right reasons, especially around, I would call, global South, global North inequality, and perpetuating that. But even locally, offsetting is not something that is widespread. And for example, the voluntary carbon market gets so much attention while it's such a minuscule small market. It's smaller than the German pet food market, for example. It is meaningless in a large scheme, scheme of things when it comes to bridging both the climate and nature finance gap. Now, obviously, for biodiversity, offsetting aside whether you like the concept or not, it is just way less feasible to do biodiversity offsetting in a voluntary basis, because to do any credible sort of offsetting for nature, you need very clear rules, ideally created and enforced by a governmental institution that would be followed. And voluntary market by definition is voluntary. So you have, a lot of different credit standards. You have maybe an organization or two that is stewarding them and acting as the key alliance of the market, but it has no enforcing powers. So bad behavior is bound to happen if you don't have enforceability when it comes to these offsetting claims in the voluntary biodiversity market. So at the moment, virtually no biodiversity credit scheme, voluntary biodiversity credit scheme, supports offsetting. Instead, they support so-called contribution claims, where you can, as a company, can buy these credits, you can retire them, and then you can say, we bought 10,000 voluntary biodiversity credits, enhanced, let's say, restored 1,000 hectares of ecosystem X, and that's it. And then you can, add it as part of your sustainability report. Maybe in the future, you could also add it into local or national restoration preservation goals. Maybe ideally even to the UN level goals. But for now, just a credible claim about your positive impacts is good enough. Offsetting can only happen at the moment for biodiversity markets, compliance markets, which has been happening for the past 40, 50 years. And it's a way larger market than the voluntary carbon market, which, if you want to, we can dig into that as well.
Yes. For example, what is the compliance market?
What is the compliance market? In a way, I'm not sure I understand the question.
I actually don't know what that means.
Oh, okay. So,
Yeah.
so basically it's, you can imagine the voluntary carbon market, which is voluntary, but then, instead of buying credits because you want to, you'll buy them because you need to. So you have quite some established markets or establishing markets across the world that implement locally or nationally certain biodiversity markets. So the biggest example and the most mature example is wetland mitigation banking in the southeast United States, where it's been up and running for the past 40 plus years, and it's a large multi-billion-dollar market per year. Which nobody knows about, but it exists and it's up and running. Even on the environmental scale, it's one of the most successful schemes out there. So that is a clear example. Colombia has a fledgling compliance biodiversity market. Australia has just started their own national voluntary market, but it's a national one stewarded by the government. You have England with their biodiversity net gain legislation started last year. That is a prime example of a biodiversity credits market. You have Germany, Finland has just started their own, France, etc. And you have 20 more, or roughly in total 20 governments that are actively exploring or running these schemes. And they're let's say they offer less flexibility than maybe some voluntary schemes, but they're standardized, they're clear, they are enforceable, most importantly, which prevents bad behavior.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, in these countries, there is a law that imposes to some companies. I know quite well the UK biodiversity net gain, which is for builders. So if you want to build somewhere in England, then you need to ensure that you either offset your impact or create positive impacts. So why is it a market though? Do they sell these credits? Because I thought it was more like I create my project and then I just make sure that I respect the rules and then everyone is happy.
Yeah, so it's a spectrum on what you consider a market, right? Is it just, let's say, a system that allows one-off single transactions, or is it a liquid market where a lot of transactions are happening, and you can imagine it as being, I don't know, let's say a commodity market. Obviously, the most schemes are on the former end, where there's not necessarily that much trading going on, but it is possible in many places. And it's not just a permitting exercise necessarily. It also can introduce potentially secondary markets, which is a very, very dangerous concept in nature markets, because it does promise scale, but it also promises a lot of potential integrity problems. So that is definitely a challenge. Since unlike carbon, since we haven't agreed on how to quantify nature globally, then measuring it and tracking its value is sometimes, or more often than not, it's the value lies in the eye of the beholder. So maybe for for a single nation, biodiversity XYZ or certain ecosystems have more value than for others, and then you will not have buyers and sellers agreeing on the price. So most of these schemes are not very, or most of these markets are not very liquid, as far as I know, because they're also not very transparent. There's not a lot of trades happening back and forth. There's usually a couple of trades before these credits are used, aka retired and removed from circulation. And we're seeing the same situation happen with voluntary markets and biodiversity as well, where we usually see just a single transaction from project developer that creates projects and sells credits to a buyer who then just takes the credits and retires them or never uses them again. So that is the status quo in the compliance markets as well.
Okay. Going back to the voluntary biodiversity markets, who are the players at the moment? And do you expect any more players to come in when it becomes more mature?
You can look at the players from a couple of categories. So let's start with the credit schemes, which are the rule setters of how to issue these credits, which is, for example, Vera or Plan Vivo, some of the more famous voluntary carbon market standards. Then you have a Scottish company called Credit Nature that has an ecosystem-based scheme that is getting a lot of market traction early on. These are some of the main ones. Wallacea Trust is another one, a very famous biodiversity credit scheme. But we have, like I said, over 80 schemes out there. Another group I would look into is project developers. So organizations actually doing projects on the ground, restoring or protecting nature. Some of the main ones are Terrasos, a Colombian project developer, Wilderlands, an Australian project developer, Replanet, a global one, Level, which is a famous African project developer. And then we have the measurements, reporting, and verification providers. So basically, usually these are tech companies that provide different technologies to measure nature. It can be based on satellites. It can be based on acoustic sensors. It could be based on camera traps trying to identify a different species. But these are the technology providers that project developers use to ensure that their nature outcomes are real, quantified, and verifiable. Then you have, I call them best practice setters. So organizations that are usually nonprofits that focus on shaping the market so it is as high of integrity as possible. Some of the main organizations are Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which is UN-backed organization that is setting these best practices. Another one is International Advisory Panel on Biocredits, which is a English or UK French coalition. And then you have World Economic Forum as well playing a big part. And then we have the early country adopters that I mentioned earlier, which also have a strong interface with the volunteer markets as well. Since volunteer markets act as a playground, as a sandbox in a way for compliance markets. That's what we're seeing early on, because these are lower stakes. Teams can innovate faster. You can experiment faster. You can understand maybe which type of credit schemes work better in certain contexts and which do not. And then you're seeing policymakers follow that and then look to pick the winner or adopt as much as possible from the winner in their own nature credit policies. And that's what we're seeing, for example, in the EU. The European Commission is exploring, very actively developing a nature credit market across the EU. And now it's carefully following what's happening on the voluntary side so it could see what could they take away from that for their own policies.
How big is the market currently, and at what rate has it been growing?
The voluntary biodiversity market gets so much attention, but it is a stretch to call it a market, because now in total we just did a stock take of all the voluntary transactions in Bloom Labs, and the number is roughly just a little bit above $7 million. And that's not annual transactions, that's total.
Like ever? Like
ever.
Okay, wow.
Having said that, the first transaction happened in 2022, which was a couple of tens of thousands, and it has been growing ever since. So most of the transactions that have happened took place in the past 12 months. So there is, percentage-wise, the growth is large, but the base is so low that it is a stretch to call this a market. And a lot of these transactions are either deeply interlinked with compliance markets, where, for example, volunteer buyers buy these credits because they know that project also is, or another part of that project is used for compliance markets. So they have that extra credibility that a government has looked into it, created some rules, and there's more credibility in supporting these projects. You have a lot of carbon and biodiversity overlap where you're seeing a lot of biodiversity credits be sold together with carbon credits in a so-called carbon and biodiversity bundling, which I'm happy to dive into as well. And these are usually one-off transactions. So, it's a stretch to call this a market.
Interesting. Yeah, why not explaining a bit more about this bundling?
So it's carbon and biodiversity bundling is basically putting a unit of carbon, which is a ton of CO2 equivalent, with a unit of biodiversity together and selling them as a single bundle. So as a buyer, if you want to buy that ton of carbon, you have to buy it together with, let's say, 1% increase in the basket of metrics, of biodiversity metrics for 1 hectare over 30 years. Let's say that's a unit that can happen, that can be used for biodiversity, and you must buy both of these. So basically, it's another way to monetize a piece of land. Carbon is one way. Biodiversity is adding additional ecosystem service to the same land and reaching that so-called biodiversity premium. So we are seeing now early on that carbon projects that have biodiversity units bundled together tend to be more expensive because these biodiversity credits or units, and no matter how you call them, bundled together with carbon, act as a quality assurance layer that nature-based carbon project actually also led to increase in biodiversity. So up until now, that was never the case. Carbon credits often and usually would not necessarily result in biodiversity increase, especially if you would plant, a monoculture like eucalyptus. You can be sure that biodiversity will decrease or stay at a very low level, but you can suck a lot of carbon very fast. And then, the questions of whether these, monoculture ecosystems are durable and whether in 30 years, it's not likely that they will catch a huge fire.
Disease or
disease or fire. These questions are kind of shoved aside a bit. Now, finally, we're at the point where unless you also consider biodiversity at the same level of importance as carbon, these projects are losing value. So now we're seeing that quantifying biodiversity is becoming the status quo even for carbon projects. I would say that early on, this is where biodiversity credits will make the most impact, not as standalone biodiversity projects, which is possible in carbon poor ecosystems like coral reefs, for example, or ecosystems that do not sequester carbon. But in carbon markets, you'll see a lot of new projects be built together with biodiversity from the very beginning. And that's where you'll have this shadow market of biodiversity where it will go under the category of the voluntary carbon market, but actually a big chunk of that value will be built by biodiversity.
That's so interesting. When I started learning more about the carbon markets, I realized that you can't just plant a tree. It doesn't work like that. But as consumers, we hear it all the time. Oh, it's fine, buy this, we'll plant a tree. But then you realize that there is so much more work that needs to be done around that. And as you mentioned, the monocultures are actually, they're not very sustainable in the sense that they will probably not last a long time.
Exactly.
You mentioned earlier the global south, and that's been a thorny subject for the voluntary carbon markets. There's been a lot of issues around human rights, breaches, land grabs, and in general, like a way to neocolonize the global south. So how can we deal with it both in the carbon markets really and also in the biodiversity markets?
Yeah, that's an issue that has been one of the, if not the most pressing one, I would say, because the question around offsetting or the legitimacy of carbon markets in general are very important. But I think at the end, you have to look at, are the projects making the lives of the local people better? Whether that's indigenous peoples or local communities, are these projects actually making their livelihoods better? And if they're not, you might achieve short-term outcomes, whether that's for 5, 10, 20 years, but you can be sure that these projects will not last, because if people on the ground are not satisfied, they're the ones usually stewarding the ecosystems, doing the work, and unless we build a system that values the conservation of nature as much and ideally more than it values the destruction of it, it is only a matter of time until that project fails ecologically as well. So I think even practically, we've done ourselves a big disservice by ignoring a lot of times or not fully acknowledging the rights of the local communities. And now biodiversity market has also come up during this time of the carbon market comeuppance and very bad publicity at times, and it's tried to almost counterposition itself as the market that actually is good for the local communities. So it's not that simple, but you are seeing now with the early development on the market the stronger guardrails against abusing any of the, let's say, inherent power of the global north, which comes usually in access to capital. If you have access to capital, you can then, there's power imbalance. There's cultural differences, and you can, and there are incentives to abuse that sometimes, or you can easily slip down that track, even if you have the best intentions. So now you have things like explicitly adhering to the rights of the indigenous peoples across the, in the articles of the UN need to, these credit schemes are way more strict with requiring the projects to consult with the local communities from the very beginning, to co-design these credits, and then most importantly, to make sure that ideally these projects are owned by the local communities. That's the end goal. It's a long way. We're getting there. There are some projects that are locally owned and led, but the majority isn't because you need time to even share this concept and build that trust for people to put their resources behind. And then you also have very specific policies, like, for example, benefit sharing. So some of the credit schemes I mentioned, which is Plan Vivo or Wallacea Trust, they have specific requirements to share at least 60% of the credit revenue with the local communities. That was never a thing with carbon. That still isn't a thing with carbon, actually, for the most part. And that is becoming a game changer in biodiversity markets, where you are required to benefit the local communities. You can share these benefits in many different ways. It can be purely financial. It can be through capacity building. It can be through ways that folks on the ground require and ask for. But at the end of the day, it has to be done. The accounting around also biodiversity revenues is also becoming more strict, where you need to share where that money went from the very beginning. That is still not a full strict requirement everywhere, but it's way stricter than in carbon. And actually, carbon I was also getting affected by the same push to be more transparent. And transparency solves a lot of issues. It's way harder to misbehave under transparent rules. And biodiversity is starting this market with that in mind from the very beginning. Having said that, I can guarantee you there will be issues, there will be misbehavior, there will be gaming the system. There will definitely be bad players in biodiversity, just like there were in our carbon cowboys. It's human nature to game the system. Obviously, we need to fight that, and that's incredibly important. But if we expect perfection from the very beginning, I think we're fooling ourselves. That will not happen. Nor has it ever happened. But we need to minimize it, because there will be players trying to game the system for sure.
Sounds like the biodiversity markets are learning the lessons from the carbon markets a little bit.
Yeah, that's the framing, and that's how the market positions itself. But problems like additionality, for example, you can't just say we solved it, check mark. It's a thorny issue where additionality is basically a requirement for you to share that unless you receive this carbon or biodiversity credit revenue, this project would not have taken place. But then, if you know this requirement, you also are incentivized to then bend the rules a bit, or make different assumptions that would allow you to claim that this project is additional. But maybe without your project, this land would have still been preserved anyway, because maybe there's not enough biodiversity loss drivers locally. So basically, then you just have no net impacts, but also are charging for it. So this issue is not solvable like that. You have also technological innovation like dynamic baselines, which instead of, let's say, once every few decades, change or adjust and quantify the baseline of, let's say, ecosystem conversion annually. So then you get credited, or you can issue credits accordingly to that baseline. Because, for example, if the conversion risk was very high early on in a project, but it decreases for some reason over time, and you still use the old baseline, then you are issuing way too many credits in the future than you actually should. But now, once these baselines are quantified more often, you cannot simply game the system anymore. And that's a good example, but these are bits and pieces, and there will be issues around leakage, for example, as well, where you might preserve this ecosystem, but then folks who want to ranch, and raise cattle will just go to another place.
Right.
And if you don't account for that, you are also not achieving the impact you claim to be achieving. And these issues are not technical issues only. There's a lot of capacity building, jurisdictional maturity that needs to happen for these issues to get less tense. I don't see them changing much over the next years or decades, though.
Sounds very complex. Is there anything that we haven't covered today that we should have absolutely done?
I think I would like to double down a bit on the compliance markets and say that at this point in time, biodiversity is, and we haven't even defined it, but there's this variability between organisms, species, etc. It is a public good usually, and public good means that it provides value, and in this case, let's only focus on the economic value. It provides value to multiple stakeholders. It can be local communities, it can be municipality, companies, many different companies. And because it's a public good, you're not, as a private player, you're not incentivized to preserve or restore it, because you're not the only one benefiting from it. And that's not something you can change fundamentally. So public goods, by definition, will require force from the public as well. And in this case, I'm talking about the compliance markets. Ideally, you would just tax the companies more and just move more of that revenue to nature preservation and restoration. In my opinion, well, that is the ideal. We're not there, and unless you're a politician or a revolutionary, what can you do, right? If that's not the case, we need to make sure that compliance markets do not take away from public budgets that go to nature, and we need to acknowledge that they're the only feasible ways to scale biodiversity markets at the moment. It's not the voluntary market. The voluntary market, might reach considerable scale, and it might reach many billions, or there's estimates that it would reach 180 billion by 2050, which is not the most realistic thing to say the least. But under the current circumstances, compliance markets are definitely the way to scale. Globally now, these markets comprise a market larger than $10 billion per year, and are much larger than the voluntary carbon market. And if they achieve the outcomes, they are net positive. The outcomes that they aim to achieve, I think that's the biggest lever to push. Not the voluntary side. Voluntary side is a great playground, sandbox, and a way for companies to contribute on top of it. But we need to make sure that these market forces are integrated well into the governmental layer as well.
What a great chat, very informative. Thanks again for joining the podcast, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in once again. We are on social media. We also have a newsletter, so do subscribe, and see you next week.